Human beings are resilient. They can live in any conditions and anywhere. And we are so creative in the things that we do. Our imaginations are limitless. Never underestimate what people could do in the past. Archaeology can teach us so much about how people lived, and the practice of doing it, of trying to understand through the process of excavation and interpretation, I think in a way it can tell us a lot more about ourselves than it does necessarily about past communities. It opens your mind to the complexity and the diversity of the human being. If you can burn rock, if you can make rock melt, then you are a master. It would have been a fantastic spectacle to witness and to have shown people around you, look what we can do. We can melt rock. We are powerful. Don't mess with us. Dun Deardail is a vitrified fort. We don't know what date it is yet, but it's there's a lot of forts in Scotland that date back to the Iron Age. The Iron Age starts around 700 BC. Vitrified fort is when somebody at some point in time decided that they wanted to burn the fort. Essentially it is stone that has been melted or burnt at such high temperatures that it has melted. The main things that they all have in common is they tend to be very high up. Some are very prominent, that they have a really good view across the landscape. The people that lived there would have been likely very wealthy members of society. I mean, not everybody can build something like that.
Dun Deardail is very high, and so, for example, it's going to be difficult to get water, but I guess that's what you had slaves for. You send them to get the water, and you don't necessarily keep them within the hill fort itself. It's a royal residence. It's a sort of maybe not a king in the kind of medieval sense, but certainly a tribal chief and his retinue of warriors, druids, storytellers, and the families that lived with them.
It's a place of power when you see it in the landscape. It's definitely, you look at it and you think somebody really powerful must have lived there. The Iron Age, obviously, with they started making iron, and the main thing that you see created in Scotland with iron is weapons. One year people could be best friends, the next year they could be fighting.
And if you read some of the early Irish tales, myths and tales like the Ulster cycle, it's really a window onto the Iron Age, and you get the idea of fighting and feasting, of the kingly court. You get champions and chariots, druids, tales of demigods. It's clearly quite an exciting time, the Celtic Iron Age, and Scotland's blessed with some of these big forts that are symbolic of that time.
But for them, everything's so dependent on things like the season, what the weather's going to be like, whether they're going to be able to harvest the crops, or it's going to be too damp and it's going to have a strange fungal disease or something, and they're not going to be able to use it. And then what did they do? Where did they get their food from? I think that's something that definitely caused a lot of warfare at that time, is resources. And if it's a bad year for food, then people are going to struggle and they're going to fight to survive. And if that means taking what somebody else has so that you and yours can live, then people would do it.
So when the Romans coined the term the Picti, the painted people, they're talking about the Caledonian, Iron Age Caledonian tribes that inhabited the north of Scotland. And these are Celts. They're speaking a similar sort of language to Celtic nations or Celtic people in Ireland and in Wales. From the Iron Age and from the Celtic period, there is historical evidence, but it's all been written down from Roman historians who had a certain axe to grind propaganda message about barbarians and about their own civilization. So you have to take everything that the Romans wrote about the Celts with a pinch of salt. But Caesar in De Bello Gallico, his account of the Gallic Wars, writes about massive oppida. He writes very, or hill forts. He writes very positively about how they have been fortified by nature and by art.
This is probably the largest excavation of a vitrified fort since the 60s. So this is a big excavation compared to some of the keyhole things that are more commonplace now. Dun Deardail's never been excavated before. I mean, there's about 90 vitrified forts in Scotland. Quite a few have been excavated, but not to this scale. For something like this, you know, it's a slow process. The excavation, this is a 3-year project.
We still continue the tradition of hand-drawing plans of the trenches that we excavate. So when you're excavating, you don't excavate the whole trench. Somebody will be up in one corner, somebody else will be over there, and you'll just be doing your tiny little bit, a post hole or whatever it is you've been given to excavate. Where when you draw it, you have to go over the whole thing and look at it in absolute finite detail. And pick out all of the important aspects of it. And I really like that because it really makes you understand what you're looking at. And then you take off the next layer and you do it again.
Whether we'll be able to find evidence of whether it was accidental or deliberate at Dun Deardail, I'm not sure. We can hope, I guess.
Because if we can answer the question of how they vitrified, we might be able to understand why they vitrified it, because that's still really controversial. Everyone argues about that. So these are rocks that were excavated last year that I've cut open in the lab because I'm going to make thin section slides with them. So when we dig them up, we see them and they don't look great. Everyone looks at them and go, oh, vitrified rock, but when we chop them open, they look completely different. So we can see all the different minerals and rocks that are all fused together and all the rock that's melted. And this one especially, you can see the different types of rock. And you're talking about 1,300, 1,500 to get these to melt. So it must be a really sustained fire for them to get to this state.
I think it would be a huge coincidence if it was accidental, because we see so many forts across Scotland that have been treated in a similar way. And I think it would have taken, I mean, even today with the technology that we have and the resources that we have, we still struggle to recreate vitrification. So for them to just accidentally set it on fire, I don't think we would see the stone getting up to the temperatures it needs to melt.
If you've gone to the bother of building a massive dry stone rampart and all your the timber superstructure perhaps on top, you wouldn't burn it. It's perfectly serviceable as it stands. So I think that the current theory is that it is an act of destruction, but whether it's ceremonial in the sense that some mighty king has died and you burn the fort to sort of end of an era style ceremony, or is it an act of vanquish and the fort has been captured, the tribe suppressed, and to mark that, the fort is destroyed.
I know a lot of people think that it's to do with closure of a site, but we see that they were still in continuous use after they've been vitrified. So I think that it's probably a tradition that has, for some reason, occurred in the Iron Age, that people have decided to do this. And I think that it's pre-living, pre-occupation that they've decided to burn the fort.
Some people also say that it could have been a way that they strengthened the fort when they were building it. It's quite an unpopular thing with archaeologists, that, but a lot of the geologists seem to be moving in that way because they've done strength tests and things like that, but it's very controversial and archaeologists hate that one.
Whenever archaeologists mention the word ritual, that by and large generally doesn't know what it actually is. So some people think it's a status symbol, some people think it was to do with it was vitrified because people were attacking it, but other people think it's the king saying, burn this place down so I can show my power type thing. Other people think it's a structural thing that somehow supports the walls. And the bottom line is we'll never know. I mean, how would you prove that archaeologically one way or the other? And that's what's nice about archaeology, different people can have different interpretations.
When we find things, we very rarely know what they are until you sit down and you think about, okay, how would I use this? And you start doing experimental archaeology. Experimental archaeology is fantastic, brilliant. It makes you think about archaeology in a completely different way when you actually sit down and try and create things yourselves. Because you think about, okay, so I want to weave grass because I want to make a basket. So you start doing that process, but then you try a certain grass and you're like, well, this grass falls apart really easily, so I can't use this. What can I use? And you start thinking about the resources.
I'm always impressed by the sort of ingenuity of people in the past, in that things that we today see as problematic or difficult were really no problem at all. Being so embedded within the landscape, knowing the resources, knowing where to find good timber, knowing where to find good stone, there's very few people today who have that same level of knowledge. And that's why some of these more exposed sites, like Dun Deardail, can seem intimidating to us now, whereas maybe they weren't quite so intimidating back in the past.
They must have had such a good understanding of the resources around them, but they had thousands and thousands of years to gather that knowledge. And it's such a shame in a way that we've lost that. That's what draws me to archaeology, because you think, oh, it must have been this way, it must have been like that, but not necessarily. It's just the way that you have interpreted based on your understanding of the world. And I love that, because it encourages you to try and think about the world differently. I think everybody should do archaeology for that very reason, because if everybody learned to think about the world from other people's point of view, I think the world would be a much better place. You wouldn't have been able to pick and choose when you lived there, whether you stayed or went when it was pouring it down and it was howling a gale. So that was really opened my mind up about what the reality was of these people. Why did they decide to live there? Because at times it was horrible, but then when the clouds part and you're looking down on Glen Nevis and it's just beautiful, absolutely stunning, and yeah, you don't doubt it then why they picked that spot, because it's quite something.